Tonight, as you lie in a room with solid walls and a bed that remembers your shape, I want you to imagine that all of that disappears and is replaced by a cold so sharp it feels like it has teeth, a darkness that smells of smoke and damp wool, and a house made of stone that seems more interested in keeping out wolves and bandits than in keeping you warm. You step closer to that house, your breath turning white in the air, and you already know that inside this place people will somehow sleep, not just once but night after night, through winters that would make most of us give up before dawn. Before we go in together, if you enjoy drifting off to stories like this, you can gently tap the like button and subscribe only if it truly helps you rest. And as always, I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, because somewhere in the world there is always one more person trying to fall asleep under very different stars. So tonight's question is simple but quietly brutal. How did medieval peasants, living in rough stone houses with almost no insulation, no central heating, no double glazing, manage to survive the night without freezing to death, and not just survive but actually sleep, dream, and wake up for another day of work? To answer that, we are going to slow everything down and spend an entire winter night inside one of those houses, moving through the darkness, hour by hour, noticing the little tricks of warmth and habit that kept people alive when the cold pressed in on all sides. We imagine peasants' homes from the comfort of modern rooms and think of them as quaint cottages with snow on the roof and a nice fire in the hearth. But in reality, these houses were closer to stone shells wrapped around human breath and animal heat, patched together from whatever material the land would allow, built not for comfort but for survivability. There was no clear line between bedroom, kitchen, and stable, no concept of central heating, only a handful of techniques: smoke, straw, shared bodies, thick walls, and stubbornness, that together made the difference between a bitter, shivering night and the quiet possibility of sleep. Tonight, we are not going to rush through centuries of history. Instead, we will stay with one anonymous family in one anonymous village, somewhere in the colder parts of medieval Europe, and follow them from the moment the last light fades to the moment the first grey line of dawn appears in the narrow window slit. Along the way, we'll see how stone can be both a shield and a thief of warmth, how the roof itself becomes part of the battle against the cold, and how the simple act of lying down together turns into a carefully practiced art of survival. Let's begin with that first step inside. You stand at the edge of the village on a winter evening, the sky already dark even though the day never seemed to properly begin, a low lid of cloud pressing down on the fields and the faintest dusting of snow clinging to the frozen ruts in the road. The air has that particular stillness that comes when everything is too cold to move, sound swallowed by frost, and every breath feels like inhaling tiny needles. In front of you is the house, squat, a little crooked, built from stones dragged out of the surrounding fields by hands that were already tired from ploughing, the walls thick but uneven, with moss and lichen clinging in the cracks, the roof sagging slightly under its thatch of straw and turf. From the outside it looks solid enough to last a century, and yet fragile enough that one good storm might peel it open. A thin ribbon of smoke escapes from somewhere near the ridge of the roof, not from a proud stone chimney, but from a dark, vague opening where the thatch has simply been left thin, the smoke sliding out into the night as if the house is sighing. You push open the low wooden door, rough planks held together with iron nails, and the cold comes in with you like an uninvited guest. But inside it does not disappear. It simply changes shape. The air is warmer by a few hesitant degrees, but thick with smells that your body doesn't recognize at first. Wood smoke, boiled cabbage, damp wool, animal breath, the sour-sweet tang of earth that has never dried out completely, and underneath it all, the unmistakable smell of people who work hard and rarely have the luxury of hot water. This is not a house divided into tidy rooms. There is no corridor leading you to a separate bedroom where sleep waits politely. It is one single space where all of life is compressed together. The fire, the food, the animals, and the bed sharing the same air. To your left, near the center of the room, the hearth glows low and red in a shallow pit lined with stones, the last flames sunk into embers that give more light than heat. Above them hangs a blackened iron pot on a crooked hook, its sides shiny with years of soot and steam, a faint smell of onions and grain still clinging to it from the evening meal. Around the walls you see the rest of the family's world, a rough wooden table, a couple of stools, a chest that holds almost everything they own, a few tools leaning against the stone, an axe, a hoe, a wooden rake, and in one corner, separated only by a low barrier of boards and woven sticks, the animals, a couple of goats, a pig, perhaps a calf if they are lucky, their bodies turning and settling in the straw, warm shapes breathing out little clouds into the cold air. The stone walls themselves feel less like part of the house and more like a piece of the landscape that has been bent into a rectangle. When you reach out and touch one, it is damp, the moisture beading in tiny droplets that catch the firelight, and the cold that comes back into your fingers is so deep, it feels ancient, as if the wall has been storing the winter for years. Historians still argue about how helpful these thick stone walls really were, some pointing out that they could hold on to a day's warmth if you managed to build it up, others insisting that stone is a greedy material that loves to stay cold and only reluctantly gives up any heat at all. But for the family who lives here, there is no debate. This is what they have, and so they make it work. Look up, and you see the underside of the roof. Dark beams, smoke-blackened, the wood polished by years of rising heat, and above them layers of straw and reeds, patched here and there with clumps of turf or dried mud. In some places the thatch hangs down like an unkempt fringe. In others you can see thin slivers of night where the wind has worried the straw loose. There is no proper chimney, only a rough opening, and countless small gaps where the smoke slowly finds its way out. Until it does, it hangs in the room in a greyish haze, stinging the eyes and scratching the throat, but also doing quiet work, drying herbs that hang from the rafters, hardening the beams, and driving insects away from the straw where people intend to sleep. Near the far wall, a low wooden platform sits raised slightly from the earthen floor, its surface covered with a mattress that is really just a sack stuffed with straw and dried rushes, lumpy and uneven, but infinitely better than bare ground. This is what passes for a bed. There is no thought of private sleeping quarters or separate rooms for children and parents, only this one shared nest of fabric and straw, with perhaps a second pallet on the floor, if there are more bodies than space. Now watch the family at the end of their day. They have already eaten a thin stew ladled from the pot, a crust of coarse bread, maybe a bit of cheese if the goats have been kind. The smallest child is half asleep, blinking slowly in the firelight, a smear of something on her cheek. The older ones are stretching fingers that have been cold since morning, too tired even to complain. The father crouches near the hearth, using a stick to coax the embers into a small pile, and every movement he makes is careful, because he knows that this dim circle of heat is the only true luxury the house possesses. If the fire dies completely, someone will have to walk out into the darkness to a neighbour's hut, cradling a clay pot or a bundle of kindling, begging for a coal, and the night is not a place you visit lightly. The mother moves with the practiced rhythm of someone who has done this every evening of her life, hanging the pot back so it stays just warm enough not to crack from the cold, checking the animals in the corner, making sure the door is secured against drafts and more dangerous visitors, then spreading out what serves as bedding. A couple of rough wool blankets, heavy and scratchy, patches sewn on patches, so that each piece of cloth remembers a previous life as a cloak or tunic, and underneath it all the straw mattress, which rustles softly as she smooths it with flat, tired palms. You notice how little separation there is between day and night here in your world. Sleep is a different space, with its own lighting and objects. A soft, clean sheet, a pillow that belongs only to you, but in this house, the bed is simply the place where work stops and breathing continues. The same four walls, the same smells, the same cold, only now seen from a horizontal angle. The transition into night is not marked by changing rooms, but by the simple act of everyone drawing closer to the hearth and to each other. The cold makes itself known in small ways. Your breath is visible in the air, a faint mist that curls away toward the roof, and when one of the children stretches a bare foot out from under the blanket to the side, she jerks it back instantly with a quiet hiss, the chill of the stone wall startling even someone who has known winters like this all her life. On the inside of the narrow window slit, a slit, not a pane, just a vertical gap covered with oiled parchment, the first delicate feathers of frost form, shining white in the faint glow of the coals, a reminder that there is only a few fingers' breadth of wall between the sleeping family and the wind that sweeps across the fields outside. You might think that falling asleep in such a place would be almost impossible, that the mind would spin with worry and the body would refuse to relax in air this cold, but fatigue in the Middle Ages is a different animal from what most of us know. After 10 or 12 hours of labour that began at first light, lifting, carrying, bending, walking, feeding animals, turning soil, mending tools, the body simply cannot keep itself awake. The cold is not a fresh shock each minute. It becomes a steady background note, like the ticking of a clock or the hum of distant traffic in our own world, a discomfort so constant that consciousness eventually decides to fold itself around it and rest anyway. The first trick in their unspoken art of survival is simple. Pull every scrap of warmth into one small area. The family does not spread out politely as modern sleepers might, each claiming a separate space. Instead, they arrange themselves into a shape that has been learned over generations. The father lies nearest the door, where the draught is strongest and any danger would arrive first, his back turned slightly toward the entrance. The mother curls behind him, forming a shield around the smallest child, who is tucked between them like a living coal. The older children press in on the other side, their heads sharing one end of the bed, their feet overlapping at the far end under the same blanket. Even the animals are part of the design. The pig, reluctant but resigned, is coaxed to settle near the bed, its warm, solid body radiating heat into the straw. The family dog, if they have one, finds its place at someone's feet, nose tucked under tail, adding another small patch of warmth. To a modern mind, the idea of sleeping in the same room as livestock might sound unpleasant, but to a medieval peasant, it is as practical as putting another log on the fire. Every living body is a little stove, and at night the house becomes a gathering of flames that happen to breathe. As they settle, you can hear the house changing its sound. The daytime noises, the clatter of tools, the occasional low conversation, the squeal of a pig being stubborn, the rattle of a pot, fade away, replaced by a softer, slower music. The rustle of straw as people shift into place, the small sighs of children who have been half asleep for an hour already, the gentle complaining creak of the bed ropes as they take the weight of several bodies at once, and above it all the quiet hiss of the embers, shrinking but not yet gone. The stone walls do not suddenly become friendly. They still leak cold like an endless well, and anyone lying at the outer edge of the bed can feel that chill sliding along their spine where blanket meets wall. But here another trick comes into play: position. People instinctively curl into themselves, drawing knees up toward their chests, tucking hands under armpits, turning faces inward toward the warm center of the shared heap. It is the fetal position turned into a family strategy, a way to hide the most vulnerable parts of the body from the worst of the cold by turning toward other bodies and away from stone. You lie down among them in your imagination, feeling the prickly scratch of the wool blanket against your chin, the sharp, sweet smell of heated straw underneath, and the subtle warmth of another person's breath against the back of your neck. It is not the kind of comfort you know. There is no softness here, but there is an undeniable sense of safety in the density of it all, in the way every inch of space is filled with life rather than emptiness. Outside, the night is huge and indifferent, the fields wide and white and silent, but inside this stone shell everything is close and small and stubbornly warm. For a moment, your modern mind wants to ask technical questions. How many degrees warmer is the air under the blanket than the air in the room? How much heat do the animals add? How well does the stone hold what little warmth the fire gives off? But lying there, breathing in the smoky dimness, you realize that for the people who actually lived this, the measurements did not matter. Only the difference between too cold to sleep and cold, but bearable enough that you can drift off if you are brave and tired. The embers in the hearth pulse faintly, a slow red heartbeat at the center of the house, throwing just enough light to sketch the curves of faces and the line of the bed against the wall. The smoke curls upward, blurring the edges of everything, staining the underside of the roof a deeper black. Little by little, the noises grow more regular. The breathing becomes heavier, the rustling less frequent. The occasional cough or muttered word dissolves back into silence. You listen, and the house seems to breathe with the family, the stone walls taking in their heat, the roof holding their smoke, the floor carrying the vibration of their shifting weight. In this moment, the building is not just an object, but a companion that has learned winter after winter how to stand between these sleeping bodies and a world that does not care whether they wake up. The cold is still there, waiting patiently in every crack and gap, but the first stage of the night has begun, the fire lowered to embers, the bodies collected into one tight knot of warmth, the world outside shut away behind stone and thatch, and the question of survival, for now, answered with the simplest possible strategy. If you cannot heat the house, you heat each other. And with that thought, eyes half closed, you let the sounds of breathing and the faint whisper of wind against stone blur together, and you begin to understand how medieval peasants could fall asleep in houses that feel, at first, more like caves of cold than homes, yet somehow manage to hold just enough fragile warmth to carry them through to the next uncertain dawn. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, when time stops feeling like hours and starts feeling like layers of darkness stacked on top of one another, the first sleep begins to loosen its grip. You do not wake with a jolt. There is no alarm, no sudden reason, just a slow drifting upward from a heavy, dream-thick place into a softer, half-aware state where you can feel the cold again, and you become gently conscious of your own breath and the weight of the blanket pressing down on your chest. The fire by now is little more than a dull red eye in the corner of the room, half hidden under ash, its glow weak but persistent, and the air has changed too, turning sharper, clearer, as if the night outside has finally wrapped itself fully around the house and begun pushing its way in. You can taste the cold more than feel it, a faint metallic edge on your tongue each time you inhale, and when you breathe out you see that pale mist again, rising slowly and then vanishing in the dimness beneath the roof. This in-between moment, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, was not strange to medieval people. Many scholars think that what we call a good night's sleep now, one long, unbroken stretch, would have seemed almost unfamiliar to them, because their nights often came in two parts, a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, a time when they might whisper prayers, speak softly to one another, or simply listen to the house around them breathing, and decide whether the fire still had enough life to carry them until dawn. You feel someone shift beside you on the straw mattress, a soft rustle, the creak of rope underneath, and then the familiar sound of a body trying to curl even smaller inside the same blanket. It is the mother, lifting her head just enough to glance toward the hearth, eyes narrowed against the faint red glare, judging instinctively whether the embers need tending, or whether tonight they can be left to smoulder untouched. On many nights she will quietly slide out from under the covers, feet protesting against the shock of the cold floor, fingers numb as she takes the fire iron and carefully scrapes away a little of the ash, uncovering the glowing heart beneath, feeding it a few thin sticks or a handful of dry twigs saved for this exact purpose, coaxing the ember back into a tiny flame that will not heat the whole room, but will at least keep the fire alive until morning makes real work possible again. In some villages, this simple act of checking the embers became a kind of ritual, barely spoken of but never forgotten. Letting the fire die completely was not just inconvenient, It was a failure of care, a sign that someone had not done their duty to the living centre of the house. If the coals did go out, there were customs about borrowing fire from a neighbour, a small, humbling walk through the dark with a covered pot in your hands and your breath turning white in front of you, knocking softly on someone else's door and asking if they could spare a glowing coal. Refusing such a request was almost unthinkable, because everyone knew that the next night it might be you standing in the snow, shivering, hoping another household had kept its embers alive. Back on the bed, the children stir only slightly as their mother returns, the mattress dipping and sighing under her weight, and soon their breathing falls again into that slow, deep rhythm that belongs to people who have worked all day. They do not complain about the cold, not out loud, because for them it is like weather or gravity, a fact so constant that it hardly merits words anymore. One of the older children turns over so that his back is pressed more firmly against the stone wall, and even though the wall feels like ice at first contact, the child knows from years of habit that his body will carve out a small pocket of warmth if he stays still long enough, his own heat slowly conquering a handspan of stone. The air inside the cottage is colder now, but not dead. It holds the lingering warmth of bodies, the faint animal heat from the corner where the goat and pig have nestled into their straw, their sides rising and falling steadily in sleep, and that warmth gathers in subtle layers, closest to the bed and the hearth, thinning as it climbs toward the blackened roof where the smoke still curls in a pale, ghost-like ribbon before slipping out through the gaps in the thatch. If you could measure it, you would find tiny differences, 1 degree warmer near the embers, another degree near the knot of sleeping people. But no one here needs numbers, only the knowledge, born into their bones, that moving a few inches closer to the centre of the bed can mean the difference between a shivering half-sleep and a deeper, dream-filled rest. In this gentle midnight wakefulness, the mind becomes more aware of the house itself. You can hear the stones adjusting minutely to the temperature, a faint ticking and creaking that a modern ear might dismiss as the noise of old pipes, but here it is, simply the sound of cold pressing against the building, and the building answering back, the friction of wood beams expanding and contracting, the whisper of straw shifting under the weight of a new frost on the roof. Somewhere above, a hen in the thatch moves, dislodging a small shower of dust that drifts down in the dark, a reminder that the house is not just a box for humans, but a layered world with its own tiny inhabitants in the rafters, the walls, the floor. You might imagine that this halfway period between first and second sleep was filled with fear or anxiety, but in many accounts it appears as a quiet, almost ordinary interval. People used it for things that did not fit easily into daylight, for whispered conversations too small to deserve daytime's attention, for short prayers said with eyes half closed, for a moment of stillness, to think about the day that had passed, and the work that waited when the light returned. In a room like this, with the only sounds the soft breathing of beasts and children, and the wind combing its invisible fingers along the outside of the stone, thought itself slows down to match the pace of the dark. Sometimes in such a house someone might sit up just enough to look around, seeing the shapes of their family as shadowed mounds beneath the shared blanket, and in that brief second they might feel something close to gratitude, though they might not have had a word for it. Gratitude that everyone is here and breathing, that the roof has not yet leaked enough to soak the straw, that the fire still clings to life beneath its ash, that the worst of the wind is out there, and not in here. In a world where a bad winter could take lives quietly, one by one, the simple fact of lying together in a house that still stands is its own small victory. Eventually the body's insistence returns. The eyes grow heavy again, thoughts lose their sharp edges, and the cold, instead of feeling like an enemy, becomes part of the familiar background once more, a constant that the mind can fold itself around. The person who woke to check the fire eases back under the blanket, careful not to let too much cold air in, and shuffles slowly into the same shared warmth as before, knees bumping against someone else's legs, feet finding that one slightly warmer patch of straw where another body had been lying a moment earlier. The second sleep begins not with a clear line but with a gradual fogging of awareness. The red eye of the hearth sinks deeper into ashen shadow. The house's creaks and sighs fade into a soft murmur that might as well be the sea, and the whole cottage slides once again into the heavy quiet that only winter nights know, when everything that can be done has been done, and all that is left is to trust in the strength of stone, the stubbornness of straw, the thin barrier of wool and skin, and the simple, ancient fact that a cluster of human bodies pressed together will always be warmer than one alone. Outside, the frost thickens on the fields, the sky grows darker even though it is already black, and somewhere far away a wolf might pad silently along the edge of the forest, unaware that inside this squat, smoky house, a family is sleeping through a cold that would have scared most of us awake. Inside, beneath the low roof and the sweating stone, time stretches, breath by shared breath, toward the pale suggestion of morning that is still hours away. And as you lie there with them in your imagination, feeling the cold lingering at the edges while warmth quietly gathers at the center, you begin to see that their survival was not a matter of one great invention or clever trick, but of 1,000 small habits. How they tended their embers, how they layered straw and cloth, how they accepted broken sleep and quiet midnights, how they learned to use the heat of animals and of each other, that together turned a stone shell into a place where you could just barely close your eyes and let go. The night is not over yet, though, and the stone house still has more to show us: the slow thaw of dawn, the way frost creeps along the inside of walls and windows, the morning routines that wake the house back into noisy life, and the little daily rituals that prepared it to face another freezing night. But those will come in the next part, as we follow this same family through the first grey light, and learn how you rebuild warmth from almost nothing, every single day of a medieval winter. Dawn arrives quietly in a house like this, not with a burst of light or warmth, but with a slow thinning of the darkness, a gentle silvering of the air that makes the shapes in the room shift from pure shadow into something you can almost recognize. You feel it before you see it, that subtle change in the temperature of the light rather than the air itself, and when you open your eyes the fire is nothing, now but a soft grey mound, a small breath of smoke rising from a coal buried deep beneath the ash, as if the hearth is dreaming of its own warmth. You lie still for a moment, letting the cold settle over your skin like a second blanket, because in these houses the first movement of the day is always the hardest one, the moment when you must accept that the little pocket of warmth created during the night has dissolved into the wider chill of the room. Your breath comes out in pale clouds that drift upward toward the thatch, and you can see on the inside of the window slit a delicate pattern of frost that looks almost like feathers or fern leaves, a fragile reminder of how close winter presses itself against the lives inside these walls. The family begins to stir, one by one, in a slow ripple that moves across the bed like a sigh. The father wakes first, as he always does, not because he slept better or longer, but because duty pulls him into the day before his body is ready, and for a moment he simply sits there, propped on one elbow, staring into the dimness with the calm resignation of someone who knows that warmth never comes without labor. Then, with a quiet exhale that fogs the air in front of his face, he swings his legs over the side of the bed and lets his feet touch the cold earth floor, wincing slightly at the shock but not complaining, because this is how every morning begins. The mother is next, her hair tangled, her hands instinctively reaching for the smallest child who has curled into a tight ball during the night. Cheeks cold but breath warm against her shoulder, she holds him for a moment, not out of indulgence but out of instinct, a brief exchange of warmth before the day claims her attention. The older children move more slowly, rubbing their eyes with fists still half numb from the cold, their bodies stiff from sleeping in the same position for hours, straw crackling softly beneath them as they shift. The animals sense the change too. The goat shuffles, hooves tapping lightly against the wooden partition. The pig snorts once, a low sleepy sound that stirs the air, and even the hen rustling in the rafters gives a soft cluck, a sound like a question, asking whether the world is waking or whether the darkness is only pretending. The father crosses the room, each exhaled breath a pale ghost in the quiet air, and crouches beside the hearth, pushing aside the top layer of ash with the fire iron until he uncovers a faint red glow, one single ember, hardly larger than a fingernail but alive. He leans close, cupping his hands around it, breathing gently, feeding it the warmth of his own breath, and after a moment a tiny spark pulses back, widening, stretching, as though remembering what it once was. Then he adds a few thin twigs saved from the day before, and the ember catches, the smallest thread of flame lifting upward, fragile but determined. This moment is one of the quiet miracles of medieval life, repeated thousands of times by thousands of hands, the resurrection of fire from a single glowing point, the difference between cold that numbs the bones and warmth that lets the day begin. As the flame grows, the light paints the stones nearest the hearth in soft gold, revealing their uneven shapes, the patches of soot, the thin line of frost that still clings halfway up the wall where the heat cannot reach. The rest of the cottage remains a dim grey cave, its edges still blurred by shadow and smoke. But now there is a centre again, a place where life gathers. The mother rises, wrapping a wool cloak around her shoulders, its heavy folds smelling faintly of sheep and smoke, and she kneels beside the fire, adding slightly thicker sticks, coaxing the flame with care learned from a lifetime of cold mornings. The children sit up slowly, pulling their own worn tunics over their heads, sometimes without removing the nightshirt beneath, because clothing is a layer of heat, not a matter of cleanliness or comfort. The oldest tugs on woolen stockings patched at the heel, wincing as his toes touch the floor. Now, as the room brightens, you begin to see more details. That night had hidden, the thatch above has tiny beads of moisture where the warmth of bodies rose during sleep, and in some places a few droplets fall, quietly, into the waiting pot placed beneath the familiar leak. The walls, sweating in their own stone way, shine in the morning light, the lime mortar pale and cold to the eye, the shadows of tools leaning against them stretching longer as the fire grows. The smell of the cottage shifts too, the sharpness of smoke softens, mingling with the earthy scent of straw and the faint sour tang of animals waking, and when the mother pours a little water into the pot suspended above the reborn flame, steam rises in lazy white spirals, promising warmth in a world that rarely gives it freely. Outside, through the narrow slit in the wall, you can see the first real suggestion of morning, a thin line of pale light brushing the horizon, illuminating the snow with a quiet blue glow. The wind has calmed, but the cold still presses against the stone like a steady, patient hand, waiting for its chance to slip in again as soon as the fire fades. Inside the house, everything that happens now is part of an ancient routine. The father tightening the ropes of the bed frame where they sagged under the weight of the family, the children shaking out the blankets and hanging them briefly near the fire to chase away the damp, the mother stirring the pot with slow circular motions, sending the scent of warm grain into the air. These are not glamorous tasks, nor are they dramatic, but in their quiet repetition lies the real answer to how medieval peasants lived, slept, survived. The battle against cold was not won once and forgotten. It was waged every morning and every night in the careful tending of fire, in the layering of straw, in the sharing of breath and body heat, in the repairing of leaks, in the steady, stubborn refusal to let the cold inside defeat the warmth that people created together. You watch as the family gathers near the hearth, settling on stools and on the edge of the bed, hands outstretched toward the growing flames, fingers trembling slightly as they thaw. The firelight touches their faces, showing tired eyes but steady expressions, the kind of quiet resilience that comes from living close to the edge of winter for an entire lifetime. The day will ask much of them: chores, fieldwork, feeding animals, mending tools. But in this small moment, with the first heat of morning brushing their cheeks, and the stone house slowly waking back to life around them, there is a fragile sense of peace, the kind that comes not from comfort, but from familiarity, a calm acceptance that warmth must be earned, and that each new dawn is not a guarantee but a gift. And little by little, as the flame grows and the room brightens, you understand how these people could lie down each night in a cold stone house and still manage to sleep, because their lives were woven tightly with ritual, routine, and the quiet knowledge that even the smallest ember, if protected and fed, can become a fire again. As the morning light grows stronger and begins to spill across the uneven stone walls, the room slowly gathers itself into something more recognizable, each object drifting out of the shadows, as though waking from its own long sleep, and the cold, though still firmly present, loses a little of its sharpness near the hearth, where the revived fire breathes a small, steady glow into the air. The sounds of morning return in gentle waves, not in sudden bursts, but in the soft accumulation of movement and intention. The rustle of straw as children rise from the bed, trying to shake the stiffness out of their limbs, the creak of wood swollen with years of smoke, the faint huffing noise of the pig stretching in its corner, pushing its snout deeper into its bedding before deciding whether the day deserves its attention. The goat's slow, impatient exhale as it senses the promise of feed, and the distant sigh of wind brushing against the stone outside, tapping lightly at the wall, as if reminding the family that winter still owns the world beyond their door. The children rub the sleep from their eyes using cold fingers that bend a little awkwardly after the long night, and the mother, with movements that have been repeated so many times they feel like muscle memory passed down through generations, reaches for the small wooden chest near the bed and closes it carefully, hiding away the handful of precious belongings: a piece of rough soap, a spindle for wool, a bone needle, 2 folded cloth scraps that have been patched and repatched so many times their original shapes no longer matter. The simple act of shutting the chest marks the shift from night to day more clearly than sunrise ever could. The father rises first, as he always does, pulling his cloak around his shoulders with a practiced flick, and stepping toward the door where he lifts the latch and cracks it open just enough to let in a thin blade of morning light. The cold sweeps in instantly, biting at his cheeks and catching in his beard like invisible frost. Yet he stands there for a moment anyway, blinking against the brightness, surveying the fields washed in pale blue, the rutted paths lined with thin ice, the distant black skeletons of trees shivering beneath a sky. The sun has not yet warmed. In households like this, the animals are always the first responsibility, because they are warmth at night and survival during the day, and the father moves toward them automatically, reaching for a bundle of last summer's hay, splitting it in 2, and placing it before the goat and then the pig. His hand glides along their backs, not out of tenderness alone, but from the instinct to assess their condition, to feel whether they have lost weight, whether their breath is steady, whether anything in their bodies speaks of sickness or weakness, because in a winter like this, an ailing animal can mean hunger or loss before spring arrives. Meanwhile, the mother kneels by the hearth, adding a slightly larger log now that the small flames have strengthened, and when the wood catches with a sharp crack, the noise feels like a small victory, proof that the fire has returned from the fragile edge between life and death. She works with a confidence born not of comfort but necessity, stirring the pot with slow circular motions and releasing a thin ribbon of steam that carries with it the faint but reassuring scent of warming grain, the sort of food meant not to delight but to fuel a body through another cold day. The children begin to tidy what counts as the sleeping area, shaking the straw a little, lifting the blankets to let the cold air chase out the thick smell of the night, and patting down the mattress so it will not collapse entirely before evening returns. In houses like this, clean does not mean spotless or fresh. It means organized just enough to keep the cold from creeping further in, tidy enough that the house does not turn against you with rot or dampness, ordered in the quiet way that gives the mind a sliver of peace. The light now inches further across the floor, changing the room's mood with slow strokes of brightness. The smoky greys that ruled the night soften into hues of worn brown and dusty gold, and the shadows, which seemed so heavy hours ago, shrink back toward the corners, becoming gentler, less threatening, as if the house itself is exhaling after a long, cold hold. Even so, the cold remains. It lingers in the stones. It breathes through gaps beneath the door. It waits patiently behind the low window slit. And though it retreats a little near the hearth, it never truly leaves, for in winter it is the constant companion of every person who lives within these walls. Now the mother hands a small wooden bowl to the eldest child, the first warm thing any of them have touched since waking, and the boy wraps his fingers around it, letting the faint heat seep slowly into his hands. It is not enough to chase the cold from his bones, but enough to remind him that warmth exists, that it can be coaxed and collected and shared. The father finishes with the animals, brushing a bit of straw from his sleeves, and steps back toward the fire where he warms his palms, holding them so close to the flames that the glow turns his skin the color of red clay. There is relief in his expression, but also a solemn, enduring awareness that this warmth is temporary, fragile, and must be protected throughout the day if the night is to be faced without fear. And as the room brightens and breath becomes less visible in the air, you begin to understand with even more clarity how these people navigated winters that would crush most of us, not with grand inventions or secret knowledge, but through ritual, small, steady acts, repeated every morning and every night, tending the fire, feeding the animals, repairing the roof, stirring the pot, tightening the ropes of the bed, sealing the cracks with straw or cloth, and gathering heat wherever it could be found. The day has only just begun, and the cold stands patiently outside the stone walls, waiting for its next chance to slip in. But for now, the fire burns, the children eat, the animals settle, and the stone house, ancient, cracked, and deeply alive, holds them all in a fragile but stubborn warmth that carries them forward 1 hour at a time. As the last of the morning's thin porridge is eaten, and the fire settles into a steady, trustworthy burn, the rhythm of the day begins to take shape, not with any loud declaration or sudden burst of energy, but with a gradual gathering of tasks that pull each member of the household gently but firmly into motion, the way a river draws small currents into its flow until the whole landscape seems to move with it. The father is the first to step outside fully, pushing open the door with his shoulder, because the frost has made the wood swell overnight, and the moment he crosses the threshold, the cold outside reveals itself not as an absence of heat, but as a presence all its own, sharp, intrusive, almost animate, brushing against his face like a creature testing its first touch. His breath turns white and heavy, rising in slow columns into the pale air, and for a moment he simply stands there, letting his eyes adjust to the glare of winter morning, taking in the familiar sight of the village, the neighbouring cottages crouched low to the earth, their thatched roofs dusted with snow, the thin plume of smoke rising from a distant chimney hole, the sharp black outlines of bare trees reaching into the sky like frozen fingers. His boots crunch through a layer of frost as he crosses the yard, each step leaving a shallow imprint that glitters faintly in the early light. He checks the small woodpile leaning against the outside wall, running his hand over the pieces of chopped timber, and realizing, with a sigh that only someone who has lived many winters would understand, that the stack is already lower than it should be for this time of year. Wood is life, and no matter how much one gathers in autumn, winter always asks for more. Behind him, the mother steps outside only briefly to shake the blankets and let the smoke-laden air from inside trade places with the crisp morning breeze. The blankets crackle faintly as the cold air bites into the wool, and she beats them gently with her palms, watching tiny specks of dust and soot rise into the sunlit air before drifting away on the wind. She stays only as long as she must, long enough to freshen the bedding, not long enough for her fingers to go numb again, and then she returns to the hearth, adding more water to the pot, so that something warm will be waiting when the family gathers again in the middle of the day. Inside, the children begin their own small responsibilities, each one simple on its own but vital when woven together across the season. The oldest gathers the stray pieces of straw, and spreads them evenly under the bed and across the corners of the room, knowing instinctively where the cold is strongest and where the floor needs that extra layer to keep the night from creeping upward. Another child uses a small wooden broom to brush aside the bits of ash that fell from the hearth during the morning tending, the bristles sweeping in soft arcs that push the dust into a corner where it can later be added to the midden heap outside. Even the animals play their part in the daily renewal of the house. The pig, now fully awake, snorts and shifts and sends a small flurry of straw into the air. The goat stretches and lifts its head, its breath steaming softly as it watches the father move back and forth through the doorway. In a house like this, the boundary between human and animal is thin and practical. Everyone contributes body heat. Everyone makes noise. Everyone breathes the same cold air. Everyone shares the same limited space in the quiet alliance that survival demands. When the father returns to the doorway, his arms full of wood he managed to retrieve from the pile without slipping on the icy ground, the warmth inside feels almost shocking, as though the house has wrapped itself tightly around the fire and refused to let the cold pass any further than the door. He sets the wood near the hearth, stacking each piece with the kind of care that comes not from neatness, but from the knowledge that every stick must be burned wisely if it is to last until spring. The mother gives him a small nod, a language all its own, and continues stirring the pot, the steam curling around her face like a delicate veil as she murmurs something to the youngest child who has climbed into her lap for a moment of comfort. That moment, quiet and unremarkable to an outside eye, is one of the small anchors that hold a family together through a winter like this. A breath of warmth passed from parent to child, a reminder that the day may be hard, but the house is alive with care. As the morning deepens, the children dress in their heavier tunics and cloaks, pulling hoods over their ears and wrapping narrow strips of cloth around their hands, because even chores done close to home can sting the skin in weather like this. They step outside in a careful line, following their father toward the narrow fenced area where tools lean against posts, and where the cold soil waits beneath a crust of frost. The fields are not ready for work, not in the way they will be when spring softens them, but there are still tasks to tend, checking traps set the night before, inspecting the woven fences that keep animals from wandering, gathering fallen branches that might serve as kindling, clearing pathways packed down by last night's wind. Every step echoes softly in the morning quiet, the sound swallowed by snow and the vast breath of the season. Back inside the house, the mother lingers near the fire, her hands extended to catch the warmth, her breath slowing as the flames brighten. Around her the shadows shift gently, reflecting the quiet truth of winter in a medieval home. That warmth is a circle you build every morning from almost nothing. That comfort is not a condition but a ritual, and that surviving the day begins with tending the smallest flame into strength again. Outside, the father and children bend toward their work, their silhouettes outlined against the pale sky like figures carved from frost, and the house watches them go, its stone walls holding the memory of their steps, its thatched roof whispering as the breeze passes through the layers of straw, its hearth glowing quietly in the dim room where the mother moves with the slow grace of someone who knows that winter is not fought with force, but endured with patience. The morning stretches forward in a long, pale arc as the family moves slowly across the frozen yard, each step measured not out of hesitation but out of the instinctive respect people develop. When the earth beneath them is hard as iron and slick with thin, invisible ice, their breaths trail behind them in faint white clouds, drifting upward before dissolving into the wide stillness of winter. The father leads the way, carrying a wooden rake over his shoulder, its teeth worn smooth by seasons of use, and the children follow close behind, huddled in their cloaks as the wind slips its cold fingers beneath the fabric. Despite the frost that bites at their cheeks, their faces remain calm, trained from early childhood to accept the cold as something that belongs to life rather than something that interrupts it. They walk toward the small plot of land at the edge of the village, a narrow stretch of earth that in summer looks alive with green shoots and tangled roots, but now lies in rigid silence, the soil locked beneath a thin crust that glitters faintly under the sun. Still, even frozen ground demands attention, and the father begins to inspect the fences, bending to press on the woven branches to make sure no part has loosened in the night's wind. The children scatter to check the simple traps placed near the hedgerow, loops of cord, and small wooden mechanisms meant to catch rabbits or birds. But most are empty, the animals too clever or too scarce in this season to walk willingly into hunger. The air here feels different than it did inside the house, sharper, more metallic, carrying with it the scent of snow and distant smoke from other hearths. It is the kind of cold that slips beneath clothing and settles inside the bones, making even small tasks feel slower, heavier, as though the world itself has grown thicker. The children pause from time to stomp their feet, trying to bring life back into their toes, and their father, while pretending not to notice, shortens the path of their chores so no one stays out longer than necessary. When the wind picks up, bending the brittle grass and sending a spray of ice crystals into the air, they turn toward home again, following the thin trail of footprints they left in the snow. The house appears almost like a creature resting on the earth, its low roof hunched under the weight of winter, its walls darkened by smoke but solid, dependable, shaped as much by weather as by human hands. The moment they open the door, a wave of warmth, small but real, wraps itself around them like a muted embrace. The interior of the cottage is dim, lit mostly by the steady glow of the hearth, and the air carries that mixed scent of smoke, wool, and simmering grain that belongs only to houses where life and survival are entwined so closely they cannot be separated. The mother looks up from her work near the fire, her face touched by the amber light, and the children hurry toward her, drawn instinctively to the warmth of both flame and parent. She ladles a thin, warm broth into wooden bowls, the steam rising in gentle curls that fog the air, and the children cradle the bowls in both hands, letting the heat seep slowly into their fingers. It is not a feast, it is not even particularly filling, but it is warm, and in winter warmth is the closest thing to luxury. As they eat, the father sits near the hearth and begins repairing a tool, tightening the handle of a hoe, smoothing the wood with a knife whose blade has seen more winters than he has. He works with a kind of quiet concentration that speaks of necessity rather than craft, because tools are extensions of the hand in a world like this, and a cracked handle or loose fitting can mean a day's work undone by cold or misfortune. The children finish their bowls and gather near the bed, spreading the blankets neatly, shaking out the straw, and patting down the edges to ensure that the warmest part of the house stays ready for the long night ahead. It is only midday, but even now, even as sunlight touches the roof outside, the thought of night lingers in every action, because in winter the darkest hours always feel closer than they should. The mother moves through the room with slow, deliberate steps, tending the pot, checking the window slit for drafts, adjusting the mat of straw pressed against the lower part of the wall. Every gesture is a small defense against the cold, a quiet reinforcement of the fragile boundary between warmth and winter. Outside, the wind softens for a moment and snowflakes drift lazily past the door, swirling in small circles before disappearing into the shadows. Inside, the house seems to tighten itself around the family, its stones absorbing the heat of the fire, its beams creaking softly, as if settling into its role as guardian once again. The afternoon deepens, and with it comes the familiar hush of winter hours, the kind of calm that invites reflection, that makes even small sounds feel amplified. The crack of a log splitting in the hearth, the soft snort of a goat settling down, the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the village, all echoing faintly against the stone walls as though the house is holding every noise inside its memory. And through it all, the fire continues its quiet labor, turning small sticks into warmth, pushing back against the cold that waits just beyond the door, and preparing the house, little by little, for the long evening that will follow. As the afternoon begins its gradual slide toward evening, the light inside the cottage shifts almost imperceptibly, turning from a pale gold that clings to the edges of the stone walls into a deeper, softer hue that feels more like a memory than a color, and the fire's glow starts to stand out more clearly, painting faint amber reflections on the rough surfaces around it. Outside, the sky thickens with a blanket of grey clouds that drift low over the village, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the wind begins to pick up again, brushing against the door with a dull, rhythmic sound that resembles a slow heartbeat made by nature itself. It is the kind of wind that signals the coming of a hard night, one of those nights when even the animals hesitate before stepping too close to the cold. Inside the house, the family senses this shift without needing to think about it. The father brings in the last armful of wood for the day, thicker pieces reserved for the long hours after dark, and places them carefully beside the hearth, knowing that once night settles, every trip outside will feel twice as cold and twice as far. He wipes the frost from his beard with the back of his hand, then crouches near the fire, coaxing the flames higher with measured movements. The smoke spirals upward, weaving through the rafters in slow, silvery trails that catch what remains of the daylight before disappearing into the thatch above. The children, still warm from the midday meal, gather in the center of the room as their mother asks them to help with the evening preparations. They sort through bundles of straw, adding fresh handfuls to the sleeping area and smoothing them with flat palms so that the bed will be soft enough to lie on and thick enough to hold what little warmth the family can share. The youngest tries to help too, clutching a few pieces of straw in fists too small to do much good, but the mother smiles and lets him scatter them anyway, because in a house where survival is a collective effort, even the smallest hands carry meaning. Now the mother turns her attention to the walls, pressing her fingers into the strips of cloth wedged into the gaps between the stones, feeling for drafts. Where she finds a cold whisper of air slipping through, she pushes new bits of wool or moss into the cracks, sealing them with the calm efficiency of someone who has known winters far harsher than this one, and understands how even a narrow trickle of cold can drain warmth from a room. She checks the window slit as well, touching the edge of the oiled parchment that covers it. The material is stiff from the cold and coated with a thin glaze of frost on the outside, but it still holds, letting only a faint blue light filter through. As the sun sinks lower, the mother prepares a simple evening meal, another stew, thicker this time, made from grain, root vegetables, and whatever small scraps remain from the week's provisions. The scent of it fills the room slowly, blending with the smoke until the whole house smells like a mixture of warmth and earth, comforting in a way that is both physical and emotional, as though food and fire combine to remind the family that they are not alone against the winter. The father takes a moment to sit on the wooden stool by the door, carving a new handle for a tool that lost its grip earlier in the day. He works quietly, the scraping sound of the blade against wood echoing softly through the room. His face is tired but not defeated, tired the way anyone becomes when the day has been long and the cold has seeped into every joint, yet steady with a kind of endurance that comes from years of living close to the rhythm of the seasons. The children gather near the hearth now, their hands stretched toward the flames, their faces glowing orange in the shifting light. They speak in hushed voices, laughing quietly at something only they understand, and their breath rises in small, visible puffs each time they exhale, proof that even with the fire burning steadily, the cold still waits in the air, settling gently into the corners of the room like an invisible guest. Outside, the world grows dimmer, the clouds thickening into a restless, swirling grey. Snowflakes begin to drift through the sky once more, tapping softly against the door and brushing the roof with a sound like whispered secrets. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then falls silent again, swallowed by the deepening dusk. Inside, the stone house seems to pull the family closer, drawing everyone into the circle of light around the hearth. The flames crackle softly, casting long moving shadows that stretch across the walls and dance upon the ceiling beams. The mother stirs the pot with slow, thoughtful movements, tasting the broth, adding a pinch of salt from a small cloth bundle, and letting the stew thicken until it becomes something warm enough to push back against the cold of the night. As the last traces of daylight fade entirely, the father rises, closes the door tightly, and lowers the wooden bar across it with a firm, practiced gesture. The sound of the bar settling into place echoes faintly, and the house seems to sigh in response, its stones adjusting to the sudden loss of light. The room grows darker, but the fire glows brighter by contrast, filling the small space with a soft, living warmth that makes the roughness of the walls look almost gentle. The children sit closer now, leaning against one another, eyes half-lidded as the warmth wraps around them. The pig rustles in its corner, curling its body into the straw, and the goat settles down as well, its steady breathing adding to the quiet chorus of life that fills the house. And as evening settles fully into night, the family and the house prepare together, in quiet harmony for the long stretch of darkness that winter brings, each movement slow, deliberate, steeped in the ancient knowledge that warmth is never guaranteed, that night must be met with patience and ritual, that sleep in a stone house is an act not only of rest but of trust. Night descends slowly, not as a sudden fall of darkness but as a thickening of everything, shadows deepening at the edges of the room, the glow of the fire brightening in contrast, the sounds drifting farther and farther away, as if the world outside has wrapped itself in a vast, heavy blanket of silence. The wind, which spent the late afternoon pacing restlessly along the walls, grows steadier now, brushing the thatched roof with long, low sighs that settle between the beams and make the rafters creak as though the entire house is leaning slightly into the storm. Inside, the cottage feels smaller and warmer, the circle around the hearth shrinking in the darkness, yet growing in feeling, gathering the family into its glow, as though the fire were a small sun at the center of this tiny universe. The stew has been eaten, the bowls rinsed with a splash of cold water and set aside, and now the room holds the faint, comforting scent of warm grain and wood smoke, layered atop the deep, earthy smells of wool, straw, and damp stone. The mother moves slowly as she tidies the last tasks of the evening, wringing out a cloth near the hearth to dry by morning, checking the window slit one final time for leaks, adjusting the straw at the base of the wall, where a thin draught tends to slip in during colder nights. Her movements are not hurried, they are part of a rhythm older than memory, a quiet dance of preparation that she performs almost without thinking, because in a winter like this, the difference between a comfortable night and a hard one can be found in the smallest overlooked detail. The father stands near the fire, rubbing his hands together until the red patches on his skin begin to fade, then lifting one of the larger pieces of wood and laying it gently onto the coals. The flames curl around it slowly, tasting the bark, growing brighter for a moment as the log catches, filling the room with a warm orange pulse that reflects in the children's half-drowsy eyes. He watches the fire with a kind of reverence that is not quite worship but something near it, an understanding that this small, crackling light is the anchor of the entire house, the heartbeat that must be guarded at all costs. The children, now weary from the cold outside and the warmth inside, begin to drift toward the sleeping area, crawling onto the straw-filled mattress that has been fluffed and spread with care. The straw rustles beneath their weight, shifting into new shapes as they settle, and the blanket, thick and heavy with the smell of sheep's wool and smoke, is pulled up to their chins. The youngest curls immediately into the curve of his mother's side, eyes already half closed, one small hand gripping the edge of the blanket, as though afraid that the warmth might drift away if he loosens his fingers. The pig in the corner circles once, twice, then folds its body into the straw, releasing a warm exhale that melts into the humming stillness of the room. The goat, satisfied that the last of the day's noise has faded, tucks its legs beneath its body and lowers its head, its breath slow and even, adding its quiet rhythm to the soft chorus that begins to fill the cottage as the night deepens. The father lowers the wooden bar across the door, the heavy thud echoing through the small space with a finality that marks the true beginning of night. Outside, the snowflakes grow larger, drifting past the cracks in the door and catching the faint light from the fire, glowing for a heartbeat like tiny embers before disappearing into the dark. Inside, he steps back into the glow of the hearth and watches the flames dance against the stones, his face relaxed in that rare way it becomes only at the end of a long day, when silence and warmth finally outweigh the demands waiting beyond the walls. The mother joins him for a moment, standing close enough that their shoulders touch, sharing a brief wordless exchange, an acknowledgement of the day's work done, of the warmth kept alive, of the children safe and sleeping. In this world where winter can take without warning, such moments of quiet closeness are treasures, held gently and savoured even when they last only seconds. Then they too prepare for sleep, lifting the corner of the blanket and sliding beneath it, moving slowly so as not to wake the children. The straw shifts again beneath the weight of two more bodies, the bed ropes giving a familiar creak that sounds almost like a sigh. And soon the family lies together in a woven knot of limbs and warmth, the children nestled between their parents, the blanket pulled tightly around them, forming a fragile barrier against the creeping cold. The fire burns steadily for now, but the room grows cooler at the edges, near the door where the draft waits for its moment, near the window slit, where frost thickens in delicate crystalline patterns along the floor, where the earth breathes its perennial cold upward through the straw. Yet near the hearth, in the circle where all life has gathered, there is warmth, thin, modest, but enough. As the flames dim and the room deepens into shadow, the sounds grow softer still, the slow settling of the thatch above, the faint crackle of a coal shifting in the fire, the rhythmic breathing of the animals, the gentle murmur of the mother as she whispers a short prayer for safety, the father's quiet exhale, the children's breaths merging into one warm shared cloud in the coldness of the air. And all around them, the stone house holds steady, its walls thick and indifferent, its roof heavy but protective, its floor firm beneath the straw, standing as it has stood for decades, against wind and snow and frost, becoming not just a shelter but a companion, a presence that wraps itself around the sleepers with a quiet, ancient promise. The night will be long, the cold will be sharp, but you are held here together within these stones that know how to endure. Sometime deep in the night, long after the last trace of the evening's warmth has faded from the stones and the fire has retreated into a quiet bed of dimming embers, something shifts in the darkness. Not a sound exactly, not a movement, but a feeling, a subtle loosening of sleep that settles over the room the way frost settles on a window, slowly, quietly, without disturbing anything at first. And from that soft stirring the family begins to drift upward from their dreams into a place that is not quite waking and not quite rest. The cold has grown heavier now. It presses down from the roof beams, slips through the cracks around the door, climbs up through the floor in thin, invisible tendrils that reach toward the bed like curious fingers, testing for warmth. The fire emits only a faint red glow, enough to outline the curved shapes of bodies beneath the blankets, but not enough to send warmth far beyond the hearth's edge. Each breath the family exhales curls into the air, as a pale, ghostly cloud, rising slowly, and then dissolving into the darkness under the smoke-stained rafters. The first to stir is the father, though he does not fully wake. His body is trained by years of winters to sense the temperature of the room, the exact degree at which the cold becomes not simply unpleasant, but dangerous. He shifts slightly, the straw whispering beneath him, and his hand instinctively reaches out to check the children, brushing the rough wool of the blanket, until he finds the small shapes curled beside him, warm but beginning to cool at the edges. Beside him, the mother opens her eyes into the thick dark, not startled but quietly alert. She listens for a moment, the soft breathing of the animals in the corner, the faint rattle of wind against the door, the slow creak of a roof beam contracting in the cold, and in these familiar sounds she reads the night like a page in a book she has known since childhood. She lifts her head slightly, feeling the weight of the cold settle onto her shoulders like a damp cloak, and she knows what must be done before the second sleep can come. with slow, careful movements so as not to let too much cold air seep under the blanket. She slips one foot out onto the icy floor. The shock is immediate, a sharp bite that climbs from her toes up her leg, but she endures it with the quiet determination of someone who has done this countless nights before. She steps across the room, the floor cold enough that her breath quickens, and kneels by the hearth, pushing aside the layer of grey ash with her fingers until she finds the ember hidden beneath, glowing faintly like an exhausted eye. She cups her hands around it, shielding it from the slightest draught, and leans close, her breath slow and warm against the coal. The ember brightens just a little, a fragile pulse of orange that shows it still wants to live. She adds a few thin twigs, saved precisely for these midnight hours when heavier wood will not catch, and continues breathing on the ember with a patience learned from many winters. The fire resists at first, the twigs smouldering but not catching, until finally a thin flame lifts upward, so small it seems as though it might vanish if she blinks too long. The father stirs again as the first hint of light flickers against the stones, and without rising he shifts closer to the children, pulling them more tightly under the blanket. The warmth of his body joins theirs, creating a small pocket of heat in the center of the bed where the cold cannot easily reach. The children murmur softly in their sleep, one rolling closer into the curled shape of another, their breath mixing, their limbs overlapping in the unself-conscious way of those who have shared beds since birth. The mother adds 2 more sticks to the growing flame and waits until the fire's glow expands enough to push the darkness back a few feet. The room remains cold, but the difference between bitter cold and bearable cold is already forming. She sits back on her heels, rubbing her hands together to bring feeling back into her fingers, watching the fire find its strength again, small at first, then steadier, until a thin warmth pools around the hearth like water filling a shallow dish. Only then does she return to the bed, slipping beneath the blanket with a long exhale that releases the tension from her body. The straw shifts beneath them once more, the bed ropes giving a soft, familiar creak as the family reshapes itself into one intertwined, breathing shape, each person finding again the warmth of another's back or arm or chest. This is the quiet hour medieval people knew so intimately, the watch between first sleep and second sleep, an hour when dreams loosen, when thoughts drift like smoke, when the cold is at its strongest, and the house feels both protective and fragile at the same time. No one speaks. Speech belongs to the day, and the night has its own language made of breath, fire, and silence. The mother's hand finds the father's beneath the blanket, their fingers brushing lightly before settling into a shared warmth, and the fire crackles softly, a whisper of orange in the blackness that coats the ceiling. The children shift closer, the smallest one pressing his cold feet against his mother's legs, with the trust only a child can have in the presence of warmth. The animals, sensing the slight rise in temperature, breathe more deeply, the pig letting out a low, content grunt, the goat shifting in its straw and lowering its head again. Their presence is comforting, not just as warmth but as proof that life persists even in the coldest hour of the coldest night. Outside, the wind sharpens, flinging snow against the door with a muted rattle, but inside the house holds firm, every stone and beam and bundle of straw working together in silent companionship, keeping the cold at bay just enough for sleep to return. And slowly, as the warmth gathers again around the hearth and beneath the blanket, the family begins to sink back into the soft gravity of rest, drifting into the second sleep that will carry them toward dawn. The fire breathes, the house settles, the night deepens, but within these walls, shaped by human hands and warmed by human closeness, there is a fragile, enduring peace, the kind that only grows in places where survival depends on patience, memory, and the gentle sharing of warmth in the heart of a winter that never sleeps. As the night deepens toward its coldest point, the world outside the cottage seems to fall into an almost perfect stillness, a silence so complete and heavy that it presses against the walls like a second layer of stone, and even the wind, restless earlier, brushing and rattling and circling, withdraws into long measured breaths that sound more like distant sighs than movement. Inside, the fire has found a fragile balance, no longer burning brightly, but glowing with a slow, steady pulse that pushes back the darkness in soft, uneven waves. The embers at its base shift occasionally, settling with faint, crackling whispers that echo through the quiet room the way a turning page might echo in a silent library. The family sleeps again now, immersed in their second sleep, the deep restorative rest that medieval people knew well, their bodies curled close together beneath the heavy blanket. The warmth of each person blends invisibly into the warmth of the others, creating a small, concentrated island of heat in the center of the bed, while the cold continues to settle around the edges, like frost forming along the rim of a cup. The father's breathing has grown slow and even, his shoulders rising and falling gently as he presses his back against one child and his legs brush against another. The mother's arm rests over the smallest child, not out of worry now, but simply out of habit. The instinctive gesture of someone who has shared winter nights with little ones for so many years that her body knows without thinking how to shelter warmth in the quiet dark. Occasionally one of the children murmurs in their sleep, a small sound that floats briefly in the darkness before dissolving into silence, and the mother responds without waking, shifting just enough to lend comfort, the subtle language of sleeping families who know each other's movements as well as their own. The animals in the corner have settled too. The pig, a warm, rounded shape in the straw, exhales in long, rhythmic puffs that blend perfectly with the slow crackle of the embers, while the goat lies with its legs tucked beneath its body, chewing softly in half-dreaming contentment. Their small forms radiate a low, steady warmth that becomes part of the room's fragile ecosystem of heat, their breaths rising slowly into the cold air and adding to the faint haze of moisture that gathers near the ceiling beams. The stone walls, which earlier held the day's heat in reluctant pockets, have now surrendered almost completely to the cold. When the fire dims for a moment, they release a faint, creeping chill that drifts toward the center of the room in thin, invisible waves, touching the straw, brushing against the wooden stool, settling along the floor like a low mist. But the family nested together is unaware of it, their shared warmth creating a barrier so simple and yet so effective that it might as well be magic, the kind of magic born from bodies pressed together in trust. Above them, the roof groans softly, dry thatch shifting under the slow weight of newly fallen snow, beams expanding and contracting with the temperature's stubborn drop. A thin sprinkle of dust and tiny straw particles drifts down in the darkness, sparkling faintly whenever the embers brighten for a heartbeat, like stars appearing for a moment inside the house before settling quietly on the floor. Far away, across the frozen fields, a lone dog barks once into the night, the sound carried thinly on the cold air, but it fades before reaching the house, absorbed by the thickness of snow and distance. Here the walls hold only the sounds of sleepers, the low purring rumble of embers, and the soft, contented shifting of animals deep in their own dreams. Slowly, so slowly, it is almost impossible to notice. The air begins to change. It is not warmer, not yet, but it grows lighter, less suffocating, as though the darkest part of the night has finally passed, and the world is allowing the first hint of dawn to rise somewhere beyond the horizon. A faint blue breath creeps through the parchment-covered window slit, too weak to cast any light but strong enough to loosen the weight of the darkness, promising that soon, very soon, the long night will begin to break. The mother is the first to sense it. Still asleep, she shifts slightly, tucking her cold feet beneath the warmth of another body and drawing the blanket higher around her shoulders, her breathing falling into a new rhythm that mirrors the approaching change outside. The father, too, moves less deeply in sleep, his hand resting near the edge of the blanket as though preparing, even unconsciously, to rise when the moment calls. The embers, perhaps stirred by a subtle draught or by the natural rhythm of burning wood, glow a little brighter, their orange hearts pulsing softly as though waking from their own slumber. A faint thread of heat spreads outward from the hearth, not enough to warm the room, but enough to signal that the fire, like the sleepers, still lives. And all the while, the house itself holds still. The stones remain cold but steadfast, the rafters remain dark but sturdy, the thatch remains heavy but protective. The cottage has survived another winter night, standing firm against frost, wind, and the weight of snow, guarding its sleeping family as it has done for years, as it will do for years more. Soon the first grey light will slip through the window, and the father will stir, and the daily rituals of warmth, tending the fire, tightening the bed ropes, layering the straw, feeding the animals will begin again. But for now, in this quiet hour between deepest night and the first whisper of dawn, everything remains perfectly still, perfectly cold, perfectly human, held in the ancient embrace of stone and silence, and the slow, shared breath of those who sleep together to survive. As the faintest breath of morning begins to gather beyond the distant line of the horizon, the darkness inside the cottage softens one final time, losing a little of its thickness as pale strands of light slip through the narrow window slit, turning the frost on its surface into a thin, glowing veil. The fire, sensing the shift before anyone wakes, cracks softly, as if welcoming the return of day. The father is the first to stir fully. His eyes blink open into the half-light, and he listens for a moment. Listens to the slow breathing of the children curled against him, to the quiet rhythm of the mother resting beside them, to the gentle snuffling of the animals in their straw. He feels the cold pressing upward through the floor and downward from the roof, and he knows without thinking that it is time to rise. He slips from beneath the blanket with practiced care, preserving the warmth beneath it for the others, and steps across the cold floor toward the hearth. The embers are weak now, barely alive beneath the grey ash, but they still carry the memory of flame, and with a few careful movements, removing the ash, adding a handful of dry twigs, leaning close to breathe, slow warmth into the coals, they brighten, blooming gradually into a small, watchful fire that begins once more to push back the cold. The mother wakes next, lifting her head slightly as the warm glow fills the room again. She draws the blanket up around the children's shoulders before slipping out of the bed. Her feet touching the icy floor with a quiet sigh, she moves toward the hearth, checking the pot, listening to the promise of warmth in the bubbling water, her face soft in the early light as she begins preparing the simple morning meal. One by one the children rise, rubbing sleep from their eyes, stretching stiff arms and cold fingers, and gathering near the fire in a small cluster of tired, quiet shapes. Their breath turns faintly white in the air, but the glow from the new flames warms their faces, painting them in soft gold. The goat stands and shakes itself, its breath joining theirs in the cold. The pig snorts once, then settles again, content to stay in its warm corner a little longer. Outside, the world is returning to life. The sky shifts from grey to pale blue, the snow glitters with a brightness that feels almost like a whisper of hope, and the thin smoke rising from the roof announces to the village that another fire has survived another winter night. Inside, the family gathers around the hearth, sharing the warm broth, their hands wrapped around wooden bowls, their eyes still heavy with sleep. The house holds them gently, its stones cold but familiar, its roof bowed but protective, its history written in soot and straw. It has kept them alive once more, and as they eat they feel the quiet reassurance of that truth settling over them like an extra blanket. Soon the day will begin in earnest. Chores outside, repairs, gathering wood, tending animals, braving the cold again and again. But for this moment, as the first full light of dawn spills into the room, and the fire steadies into a confident flame, there is peace. The kind of peace made not from comfort but from endurance, from ritual, from the unspoken understanding that this life, harsh as it is held together by small acts of warmth repeated faithfully every day. And as you watch them, the father tightening his boots, the mother smoothing the blanket on the bed, the children laughing softly as they warm their hands near the fire, you begin to see the quiet beauty in the way medieval people greeted each winter morning, not with fear, not with haste, but with the calm acceptance of those who know that the cold will always return, And yet so will the light, and so will the fire, and so will the strength to face another day. The stone walls breathe slowly as sunlight touches their surface, the house awakening fully at last. A new day begins. The warmth holds, and for one fragile moment in the ancient rhythm of winter and dawn, everything is enough.